Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Enrico Letta. I'm the Dean of the Paris School of International Affairs at Sciences Po. I'm very pleased to welcome our speakers today and to welcome all our students and scholars to this very important moment. It's one of the incontournables, one of the top moments of our academic year is the presentation of the annual energy outlook organized and presented in cooperation with the International Energy Agents based in Paris. We are very pleased to have Tim Gould. Tim Gould is the co-head of this exercise, a longtime friend of PSIA. He usually is the one who presents our during these seminars the energy outlook. So thank you very much, Tim, for being with us once again. And with him, Professor van der Linde will be the discussant in this seminar. Professor van der Linde is from our faculty. Thank you very much, dear professor, for being with us. I just one word to say that is the first time that this presentation is online, is on the web, because of course of the present situation, but it is a long time a successful exercise that we are having, and we learned a lot every time we had this exercise. I'm sure that it will be the case today too. I'm very pleased to give the floor to Giacomo Luciani. Giacomo Luciani is the main protagonist, is the one who invented since the very beginning of the creation of PSIA 10 years ago, the Master in International Energy and all the work around the cooperation with the energy outlook. So I'm very pleased, Giacomo, to give you the floor to lead this seminar. You have the floor, Giacomo.
Thank you, Enrico. Thank you, all of you who are participating in this session. Thank you especially to Tim and Coby that will present and discuss the World Energy Outlook 2020. As Enrico has said, this is by now a tradition, and we have always greatly benefited from the presentation of the World Energy Outlook every year, and it is always a source of pride and for us and gratitude towards the International Energy Agency to see that several of our former students are mentioned and current students are mentioned in the acknowledgement page of the World Energy Outlook. It is an extremely important experience and link for us to be involved in this way in the work of the preparation of the World Energy Outlook. The outlook this year is different from the past. Tim will tell you more about it. But it is evident that the situation that has prevailed since early spring of this year, the pandemic and the subsequent economic crisis and uncertainties that are likely to continue for quite some months ahead of us, have completely changed the environment and therefore also the preparation of the outlook. For the first time this year, there is a scenario which is characterized by a difference in the underlying economic data. Until now, the agency always used the same macroeconomic data to underpin all of the three scenarios normally proposed. in this case, there is one scenario that makes different assumptions about the economic environment. And I'm afraid that down the road, the economic environment, the global economic environment, will become increasingly important for the energy picture, the energy landscape, and we will have to deal with a lot more uncertainty. But without much further ado, I pass the floor to Tim, who will present this year's outlook. Thank you, Tim.
Well, thank you very much to you, Professor Luciani. Great thanks to Dean Lette also for those kind words of introduction, and indeed to Professor van der Linde, to Coby for agreeing to step in as a discussant, a respondent. I'm always interested to hear her views, so I'm looking forward to that. Likewise, I just wanted to echo one aspect of that introduction, just to underline how much we've benefited from the partnership with SIA, with Sciences Po. Indeed, as Professor Luciani says, if you look in the acknowledgements, not just for this year, but for previous years, you'll find a long sort of list of alumni from the school. So many thanks for that. I want to talk over the next 20-25 minutes or so, some key findings from our outlook. Clearly this year is an extraordinary year. Two key questions. What impact will the pandemic have on the energy sector? And in particular, what might it mean for the prospects for energy transitions? Does it make them more difficult, or could it be the catalyst for accelerated change in some areas? And those answers are unclear for the moment, and we'll talk about that a bit more. But the clarity will emerge, hopefully, over the next few years. And that's why in this World Energy Outlook, we talk much less about 2040. We talk much more about the next 10 years, the pathways out of the crisis. And another thing that this year's extraordinary events have persuaded us once again is that there cannot be a single way of thinking about the future of energy. When you're thinking about the long term, and today even about the near term, you have to have a scenario-based approach. And so what we wanted to do in this outlook is to think through the direction that we appear to be heading based on the policies and measures that have been put in place by governments or announced, but vary that, as Professor Luciani said, according to different outlooks for public health and the economy. And then to supplement that with what more would be required if the world is to get to net zero emissions, either by mid-century or soon thereafter. Obviously, that's a big focus now for many governments, many corporate announcements, and we wanted to think through the implications of that and what remains to be done. So when we put together our energy scenarios, lots of different variables to consider. Two of the key ones, economic growth and what policy assumptions we take. This is where we were this time last year, World Energy Outlook 2019, sort of 3.5% average annual growth to 2030. And you may recall that in this stated policy scenario, we look at all the things that governments have in place or the things that they say they would like to achieve. And we don't take those aspirational goals for granted. We look at to what extent they are supported by specific policies and measures that would allow them to be achieved. And that produced, in that scenario, a roughly 1% per year energy demand growth to 2030. But of course, we are in a very different place today. The policy landscape has changed to a degree, but of course, the big change is COVID, what that's meant for the global economy. So in the stated policy scenario this time around, we assume that the pandemic is gradually brought under control over the course of 2021. And that allows for a steady but hardly spectacular recovery in global economic activity. So in 2030, the global economy is still 7% smaller than it would have been under a pre-crisis trajectory. And as you can see, energy demand is lower as well. But in everyone's mind, is the possibility that those assumptions might be too optimistic. So in a delayed recovery scenario, we explore the possibility that there are longer lasting scars from the pandemic. The pandemic itself stays around for longer. This economic slump is deeper to begin with, but there's also some long-term constraints on the growth potential of the global economy because of ingrained unemployment, bankruptcies, and other kind of structural economic effects. What does that mean for energy demand in this stated policy scenario? We get back to pre-crisis levels around 2023, but in the delayed recovery scenario, that moment is postponed until mid-decade. And indeed, if you look at the decade as a whole, that would be the lowest growth in global energy demand since the 1930s. But of course, below those lines for energy demand outlooks lie a lot of variations across different fuels and technologies. And I wanted to explore some of those here, starting with our updated assessment of what happened in 2020. Overall, energy demand down by 5%. We haven't seen anything like that for 70 years, but you can see there's a wide variation across different fuels. The most carbon intensive fuels, coal and oil, were hit hardest, which means that the fall in CO2 emissions was slightly higher than the overall fall in global energy demand. So global energy demand down by 5%, CO2 emissions down by 7% in our view. And the only major source that saw an increase was renewables, particularly in the power sector. How does this play out to 2030? In the stated policy scenario, and remember, this is one where the pandemic is brought under control next year, oil demand bounces back, but coal never comes back to its pre-crisis levels. Phase out policies, competition from low natural gas prices, the rise of renewables, that all keep coal demand under pressure and indeed accelerates its structural decline in many advanced economies. The winners are natural gas, but mainly renewable sources of energy. Natural gas markets are fairly well supplied at the moment. Prices are relatively attractive for consumers. And we also have yet to see the effects of a record year of new LNG project approvals in 2019. But in the case of renewables, we'll come back to this, but they are not yet the energy source of choice in all parts of the energy sector. But where they are strong, they are extremely strong. How does this picture change if the recovery is delayed? Some renewable projects are postponed because of the economic uncertainty, because of the lower electricity demand. But essentially, that part of the picture remains fairly resilient. The larger effects are elsewhere. Oil demand is almost completely erased. Coal and natural gas are heavily affected by the lower economic output, lower electricity demand. As we've seen already in 2020, when electricity demand is lower, it's often coal followed by gas that are the most exposed. Now, you might be tempted to look at this picture, and particularly if you're looking at it through the prism of global emissions, and say, well, that doesn't seem like such a bad outcome. Renewables resilient, coal down even further. But I would caution against that interpretation, because the impacts of the delayed recovery scenario on the energy sector go well beyond what you can see here. Economic prospects in many developing economies in particular are hit hard. One aspect that we highlight in the new outlook is that the progress that we've seen since 2013 on improving access to electricity is reversed in 2020, and regaining momentum is that much more difficult in a delayed recovery scenario. And while emissions are lower than in the stated policy scenario, in this scenario, those reductions come at a very high economic and social cost. In practice, a weaker economy also drains momentum from the process of structural change in the energy sector. So this slump, as we see in 2020, it can suppress emissions, but for all the wrong reasons. It doesn't solve the climate problem. Wanted to say a few words on oil demand. You may have seen from the previous slide that this is the fuel that most affected by the immediate crisis. The pandemic erased almost a decade of growth in oil demand in a single year. Naturally, a lot of debate over what happens next. This was our outlook in the stated policy scenario last year, and this is where we've ended up in this year's outlook, edging ahead of pre-crisis levels by 2023. And then a gradual rise thereafter. In the event of a delayed recovery, that point at which we regain 2019 levels of demand is postponed until 2027. In both of these cases, you're looking at the final decade of growth in global oil consumption. That flattens out in both of these scenarios in the 2030s. But you'll also notice there's no pronounced peak or decline. The bottom line in our view is that as things stand, an economic recovery will sooner or later bring oil demand back to pre-crisis levels. The duration of the pandemic, the severity of the economic crisis will affect how quickly that happens and where oil demand plateaus. But if you want to change the shape of those demand outlooks, you'll need to, that will require something more profound. That will require some deeper changes in the way that we meet our transport needs or the way that we consume plastics. We see some signs of those changes already, for instance, in the passenger car segment, where fuel efficiency and very robust sales of electric vehicles this year are going to put that segment into decline relatively soon. But that's not true in every part of the oil demand picture. What you would need to produce a decline is a much stronger push for efficiency, for electrification, for recycling, and that's what we get if we model a sustainable development scenario. And that depends on a surge in clean energy policies and investment well beyond the details of anything that's been planned or announced so far. So just a reminder that in that sustainable development scenario, the world gets on track to achieve sustainable energy objectives in full, including the Paris Agreement, energy access, and air quality goals. Now, looking at this picture, and in particular, the difference between the World Energy Outlook 2019 trajectory and the new stated policy scenario line, I mean, it's significant, but it doesn't appear to be a game changer for the oil industry as a whole. But that gap doesn't tell the whole story about the pressure that producers are under. Consumers have spent more than, I mean, the reduction in spending by consumers on oil products has been more than $1 trillion this year. For countries that rely on these revenues for a large share of their national budget, that's been another huge shock. Middle East, income from oil and gas has been cut by half. Parts of Africa, that reaches even up to 3/4. For companies across the industry, it's meant another round of cuts to personnel, projects, and spending. And this comes at a time when the industry is being asked to clarify the implications of energy transitions for their business models and to explain the contribution that they can make to reducing emissions. And we wanted to illustrate those pressures, not by looking at production, but by looking at the money to be made from oil and gas and how this changes across scenarios. So what you're looking at the moment on the screen is what producers could see pre-COVID, and the pandemic, in our view, has already reduced the sort of present value of future income from oil and gas by around 1/4. And accelerated structural change, as in the sustainable development scenario, would reduce that by another 1/3. I think we need to point out that sort of $11–12 trillion in present value is still a very sizable sum. And so oil would continue to remain a key commodity in the global economy for many years to come, whichever way you look at the future. But there are some important implications from this picture since the countries that rely heavily on oil and gas revenue. And this underlines the importance of the efforts to reform and diversify economies, reduce reliance on that revenue. And so fundamental efforts in that direction look unavoidable. Secondly, for the company perspective, the types of projects that companies are investing in are also shifting. Resources have to be not just low cost, but increasingly important that they are also low emissions. We've been working with a lot of satellite providers of data that give us a picture of methane emissions, at least the large leaks coming from oil and gas operations. And interestingly, there don't seem to be signs that those leaks came down in 2020, even though oil and gas production was lower. There's still a lot of work to be done in that area. And finally, just to point out that this is a message to consumers and policymakers. The pandemic has really shaken the capacity of the industry to invest. So oil demand, you remember, down by around 8%, but investment in new oil and gas supply is down by, well, I mean, in our estimation, it's down by around 1/3 this year. You can see that very clearly when you look at the financial difficulties faced by US shale, but it applies really across the board from small shale operators to large national oil companies. So if oil demand returns to anything like its previous trajectory, then upstream investment would need to pick up. Otherwise, we could be in for another price cycle market volatility. Moving to electricity, demand is expected to be strong across all our scenarios, but electricity production is witnessing a very profound transformation. Over the past 2 decades, coal-fired power very much in the driving seat, increasing more than any other source. Often in a year by year, the most built technology in 12 out of the last 20 years. However, we are entering a new era. So in each of the last 3 years, solar was the most added capacity in global electricity markets. And if we look at the generation that comes from each of those sources over the next 20 years, what we are declaring is that solar PV is becoming the new king of electricity. So that's well over 4,000 terawatt hours of additional electricity generation from solar over the next 20 years. It becomes the main way of meeting growth in global electricity demand while coal-fired generation declines. And that's a combination of policy support, falling technology costs, and one thing that we look at very closely in this year's outlook is favorable financing terms that allow solar to come through so strongly. And in the best cases, it is already some of the cheapest electricity that we've ever seen. Other low carbon technologies and gas indeed grow also in that scenario. But if we shift across to a sustainable development scenario, you can see the potential for growth in solar even higher. 8,000 terawatt hours of growth is equivalent to 12 times global solar PV generation in 2019, or nearly triple the total solar electricity generated in history. But as the world increasingly relies on electricity and solar and wind become more important, the rest of the electricity system cannot stand still. We focus a bit in this outlook on grids. As I'm sure you're aware, that's the bedrock of the electricity system, and they become even more important in clean energy transitions. And the point we wanted to make is that over the next 10 years, the requirement for grid expansion is almost double, so 80% higher in our view than it was over the last 10 years. And one key reason for that is because there's twice as much new wind and solar capacity entering the system. So just to give you a sense of scale, 16 million kilometers, that's 20 round trips to the moon. But it's not just a question of scale. A lot of the investment that needs to go into the electricity network is to make it smarter, to digitalize, to allow it to give the flexibility that the system increasingly needs. But there is an emerging mismatch between that investment need and the revenues available to grid operators. Some of the largest power systems in the world have seen significant reductions in these revenues in the first half of 2020. If those reductions in cash flow are prolonged, that would lead to difficult choices and could lead to delayed or inadequate investment with significant implications for electricity security. I wanted to come now to the implications for emissions for climate change. In this stated policy scenario, this is where CO2 emissions end up over the next decades. Rebounding to now 2019 levels just before 2030, remaining roughly stable after that. I'm sure you can immediately see that that's a trajectory very far away from what would be required to meet the Paris Agreement. We're looking there at a temperature increase, a global average temperature increase compared with pre-industrial levels of almost 3 degrees Celsius. And this is where we would need to be in the sustainable development scenario. And we've analyzed on a country-by-country basis what would additionally need to happen to get from one trajectory to the other. We've seen an increasing number of countries, including those in the European Union, United Kingdom, New Zealand, and others, making pledges to reduce CO2 emissions to net zero by 2050, or indeed earlier in some cases, and introduce sustainable recovery packages. If all of those were implemented in full, that would take a chunk out of that gap between steps and the sustainable development scenario. I'm sure we're all also aware of the major new statement by China that it would target net zero emissions by 2060. It's welcome. It's achieved in the sustainable development scenario, and it would have a very significant impact on filling that gap between the two. But there's still an awful lot left to be done. So more ambitious action would be needed in many, many other countries in order to fill that gap completely. And in addition to the sustainable development scenario trajectory, there's also increasing interest in what it would mean for the energy sector to reach net zero emissions globally by 2050. So not just individual countries like the European Union or individual companies, but for the world as a whole. And we've examined that issue in detail in this year's outlook. It would require an additional dramatic set of actions beyond the already ambitious agenda of the sustainable development scenario. And this would need to be achieved, of course, at a time when we are recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic. And we look in particular at what would be required over the next decade to put us on track for net zero emissions globally by 2050. If we look at the next decade, it really means we'd need to try and bring global emissions down by some 40% over the period to 2030. And the short answer to what would be required is that everyone would need to step up. So from companies and industries to develop and deploy new low carbon technologies at scale, including things like carbon capture, utilization, storage, new nuclear technologies, battery manufacturing capacity, and a number of new industries would need to emerge. For instance, low carbon hydrogen, where the production and use of low carbon hydrogen would need to increase by a factor of nearly 100 over the next 10 years. Citizens as well, wide-ranging effects on the everyday life of a very large number of people. We also looked at a number of behavioral issues that could contribute to a rapid reduction in emissions. But the thing that we highlight here is that global sales of electric cars would need to go from 2.5 million this year to 50 million in 2030. And finance also need to step up very considerably. The example that we provide here is investment in clean electricity technologies would need to go to $1.6 trillion over a 10-year period. And that 1.6 trillion would be the same as invested all across the energy sector in 2020. So underpinning all of this would have to be, in a sense, the role of government policies in driving innovation, supporting the development of new industries, helping to realize those changes in lifestyle choices and consumer purchases. also in mobilizing private finance and all the other areas that would be necessary for that transformation of the energy sector. One final point before I conclude. There's a tendency in the climate discussion to focus on what we build or what we purchase. But that's only one part of the story. We also need to tackle the emissions from the equipment and infrastructure that we already have. And this slide helps to explain why. So the industrial era has seen CO2 emissions steadily climb. And over that period, we've built up a whole global energy system based on thousands of carbon emitting plants and factories, millions of emitting buildings and cars. For example, at the start of 2020, over 2,000 gigawatts of coal-fired power plants without carbon capture in operation. We have thousands of factories around the world producing steel and cement, and almost 2.2 billion cars on the roads. And many of those will be with us for decades to come. So we assessed, what if all of that energy using equipment were to continue its operating in a normal way? What would that mean for an emissions profile out into the future before it is retired, and so on? So when the last plants are finally retired around 2070, continuing to operate this infrastructure as we've done in the past would emit over 700 gigatons of CO2. So that's already a temperature rise of around 1.65 degrees compared with pre-industrial levels. And power plants account for around half of that. So that's why it's so important in the scenarios that we put together that not only is there a systematic preference for low carbon infrastructure that we add, but we also need to use our existing assets in a very different way from the way that we've used them in the past. And that twin track approach is integral to the way that the International Agency is approaching energy transitions. These conclusions, I will go through them very rapidly. Maybe I'll just leave them on the screen. You can make your way through them. But I think the key point for us is that this last bullet point, there are no shortcuts. I mean, we cannot imagine that an economic slump is going to do the work of an energy transition which requires massive investment. So it's only really profound changes guided by good policies that can deliver a better energy system. And we all face choices when it comes to delivering that kind of outcome. But again, it's a traditional message from the IEA, but we say it again, this is a choice first and foremost for governments around the world. And with that, as ever, I thank you for your patience, for your attention, and be very happy to listen to Professor van der Linde and also to get any questions from your side.
Thank you, Tim, for this concise and very effective presentation, as usual. The floor is to Coby now to respond to this presentation.
Thank you very much, Giacomo. Thank you, Tim, for the clear messages, but also for the extraordinary content of the presentation of this year's World Energy Outlook. Extraordinary is the right word. The collection of red and yellow books in my bookcase, you can actually see them behind me, will have a lasting gap because this year's decision not to publish a printed version has its impacts. Extraordinary because the launch of the World Energy Outlook was a month earlier than normal. I mean, just shows that this is not a normal year. Extraordinary because rather a sole focus on the current and the long term, this year's WEO has, let's say, midterm and also a net zero scenario in it, which reflects some of the ambitions of member states or grouping of countries that are party to the Paris Agreement. Extraordinary are also the circumstances leading to this report. The collapse in energy demand affecting all international energy markets and investments due to the pandemic and the uncertainty surrounding the return of some sort of normalcy. And extraordinary is the fact that we meet online rather than in person. Although an online meeting is very different from the live meetings we're used to, I'm very grateful we can meet at all and exchange and query the information we need to understand what is happening in international energy markets to look ahead, to understand the energy policy needs, and to include our students in this journey. We are grateful that so quickly after the launch, Tim, you take time to have this discussion with us, because we need that connection to stay focused on energy market analysis, policy analysis, and understand the long-term consequences of policy decisions or the lack thereof. To the report, like I already said, this year's WEO is historical, also for the unprecedented developments in international energy markets as a result of the pandemic. Just let it sink in. For the year, we will see a decline in demand of oil of 8%, coal 7%, natural gas 4%, and a stagnation in renewables, averaging out over total primary energy demand in a drop of 5%. Moreover, global energy-related CO2 emissions reduced with 7% and investments 18%. Given the fact that international energy markets in traditional fuels are very mature, i.e. they represent really large volumes, these declines are very large indeed. They represent lost income for producers, lower performance for investors, and lower incomes for governments' budgets, not only in producing countries, but also in consuming countries, for instance, where taxing comes from motor vehicles will also be seriously axed. I'm old enough to have lived through a couple of energy crises. As a matter of fact, as a teenager in the 1970s, the 1973 energy crisis grabbed my interest, and since then I've never doubted what I wanted to study and work on. I'm sure that when the 4 scenarios were made, the team was hopeful that a second and third wave in the Northern Hemisphere would be kept at bay by the policies to enforce behavioral changes to reduce infections. Only a few months later, it looks like in the EU and in North America that we're in a second and a third wave, which brings us closer to the scenario where we have a very slow recovery rather than a quick, as in the beginning of the crisis, it was V-shaped, then it was a little bit U-shaped, but I don't know how much we want to stretch that leg on the recovery. So I think we need to look at that new scenario you made on a slower recovery very carefully. Another thing that I find really interesting when you follow the news and also this report is that it looks like the pandemic has asymmetric, is going through an asymmetric development in different geographies and also has asymmetric levels of control and therefore also the economic impact. But what we sometimes forget, and I think you pointed that out as well, is that world economic integration is already so deep that even if a country thinks that things are fairly under control, they're still going to be deeply affected, also in energy markets, because of what other countries are going through. And that is, you know, these second order effects we should keep an eye on as well. One of the remarkable short-term impacts of the pandemic on energy market has been the change in the merit order between coal and natural gas, and one of the factors leading to a substantial decrease in CO2 emissions, if this would be a permanent feature of the global energy market. But the decline in investments and production, particularly in the US, is already leading to a reverse in this price relation and drive natural gas prices up from the very low levels in 2020. There's always a time lag, but we see the rise already, and that might actually flip the merit order over again. Another message from the report is that the existing and new fleet of energy assets represents a large large lock-in of CO2 emissions. The investments in grids, as was pointed out, is very large indeed. And if I may add, some of the flexibility we need will not come from larger and smarter grids, but from clean molecules that can underpin or make possible the electrification and integration of intermittent renewable production into the energy system. That is also sometimes forgotten because we always have an electricity discussion, but we forget that actually for a large part, we're talking about molecules, both liquids and gases. Back to the remark in the report on the existing fleet and climate change. I think you mentioned, Tim, that the contribution of coal-fired power generation is a crucial factor. In Asia, new power plants are still added to the existing fleet. The issue here is that domestic coal production is partly driving those investments, in addition to security of supply policies, such as diversification to source and geography. If natural gas-fired plants were added to the power mix instead, a lot of the CO2 emissions could already be avoided, but they would not be enough to achieve the sustainable development scenario, let alone the net zero scenario. Nevertheless, the prospect of an expanded natural gas infrastructure, which can ideally be refurbished maybe later into hydrogen networks with relatively limited investments, could at least provide us with some sort of prospective view on 2050. Expanding the coal fleet without carbon capture, use or storage is a tremendous challenge for the ambitious plans of some governments achieving the SDS target, Sustainable Development Target, let alone net zero. Just like retiring the coal fleet slowly creates additional pressure on other energy demand sectors to decarbonize more deeply. This could grow into an even more politicized discussion about the distribution of carbon space scarcity, when investments and technology decisions of today impact the carbon space for countries that still have to go through an energy-intense development phase. Here, new technologies can help, but only if they are dispersed quickly enough. The large drop in energy investments, say for solar, and to a lesser extent wind, would also impact developing countries in skipping a step on the energy ladder. The tragedy of the commons could also become the tragedy of the developing countries, unless more action is taken. Government has taken extraordinary steps to keep consumption going, and fiscal deficits are growing far beyond the impact of mitigating the financial and economic crisis of 2008 and 9, which leaves the question if the capacity of government to also speed up the energy transition with investments in cleaning up the domestic energy system has become a lot smaller than before the pandemic. And on that note, I want to give it to our students who I'm sure have a lot of questions. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Coby. Thank you for these comments. You touched a number of very important points. We do have indeed already a few questions from the students. Let me say to everybody in the meeting room that if you want to ask a question, you should write it in the Q&A facility that you have at the bottom of your screen. And I would go ahead, give up on asking a question myself and go ahead with questions from the students right away. And the first one is a bit tongue-in-cheek, if you wish. And it says, from Chetna, she says, I'm curious why the agency decided to call solar the new king rather than something more gender neutral. And I'm sure you have a good answer to that, Tim.
Well, I have an answer. I'm not sure if it's a good one. The illusion there, I mean, it is a good question, and it's one that we kicked around quite a lot internally. But the allusion there is to the long-standing idea of king coal. So the notion that there was a king in the electricity sector and coal was it. Now, it may be that isn't common parlance anymore. So that reference could well have been lost. So we were conscious, we didn't want to come across in a sense, crowning solar as a new king of electricity supply, as an entity, as an organization that was kind of stuck in old sort of royalist ways of thinking about the world. But that's the reason why we did it. And in a way, it served its purpose in the sense it was a catchy way of describing that transformation, which has indeed been picked up by quite a few commentators. So, but it's a point well made.
Very good. So we are very happy about giving up on King Coal, and we look forward to Queen Solar.
That would have been one way of doing it, yeah.
Down the road. The next question is about how the pandemic situation might affect the financing for renewable energy production projects. And I think this really touches a key point because, you know, there is no doubt that the pandemic has seriously affected the financial system, okay, and the financial stability of governments. We don't really know how well we'll come out of this, but there are very significant elements of doubt and worry in this respect.
Yeah, I think it's certainly a question that we're spending a lot of time thinking about. I think you probably have to differentiate between different technologies. I mean, solar and wind, or onshore wind at least, are mature. As I mentioned, these are some of the cheaper opportunities in many economies to add capacity to the system, but they're also quite capital intensive. So the cost of capital makes a big difference to the overall cost of the electricity produced over the lifetime of a project. And now it remains the case that in most advanced economies and in China as well, borrowing costs are still low, but that's not the case everywhere. And so if you look at some of the economies that will need additional capacity over the next years, I mean, one we highlight in the book is, South Africa, for example, has seen quite a sharp escalation in borrowing costs since last year. And we estimate that that would add roughly 25% to the cost of a new onshore wind project, so the levelized cost of the electricity over the lifetime of the project. Now, you know, that's a serious issue. And so one of the questions that we're asking ourselves is, what can governments do? What can the financial sector do? What can public finance do to continue to enable some of those projects, to reduce risks, to increase the flow of bankable projects, and allow some of those renewable projects to continue to go ahead in parts of the world where they are very much needed?
Thank you. Yes, I believe the issue of finding ways to channel sufficient funds towards the emerging countries is indeed one of the key challenges ahead of us. Let me come to the next question, and from Azem, it says, you mentioned that drastic action has to be taken to realize the SDS, and that is quite clear. And is that achievable through existing policies to be implemented in a more thorough and comprehensive way, or do we really need something radically new, some new agreements or new international policy initiative?
So my view on that is that the overall international architecture can function. The missing links, I think there are two. One we've just mentioned, and that's this question about encouraging those financial flows to where they're needed. But I think the other area that seems to be very much in the minds of many people looking at the future decarbonization is some of the difficult sectors. So can we not mobilize in a sense, the coalition of businesses, government action, financial support for iron and steel, for the aviation sector, for cement, because individual actors in that space are not going to be able to achieve everything that day. So a commitment by an iron and steel company to decarbonize fully or to reach net zero emissions by 2050. It's very difficult to imagine that that is entirely within the power of that company to achieve. It requires government actions. It requires actions all along the supply chain for the different processes that it would need or the different fuels that it would need. I agree very strongly with what Professor van der Linde said about the importance of low carbon fuels in this outlook. So for many of these difficult to abate sectors, they will need liquids and gases. They will need different liquids and gases from the ones they use today. But if they are to reduce emissions, they will rely on those providers of fuels to also change their businesses. And bringing that together is an enormous challenge. And I think it's in those sectoral discussions or that alignment in the sectors that a lot of additional work remains to be done.
Next, we have two questions concerning specific technologies, I would say. The first one is about the potential role and contribution of distributed generation, so small solar. And then there is also a question about the potential contribution from small modular reactor. What is the agency's view about these reactors? Nuclear energy is not very popular with some of the governments of member countries, but the agency has stood in favor of a role for nuclear energy.
So the first point on the distributed solar, we often say in the agency that renewables have done well in 2020. We need to really differentiate across different renewables, because what's done well in practice has been utility scale solar, and what's done much less well is rooftop solar and the renewables in the end use sector, so biofuels and so on. Now, the reason why rooftop has suffered has been two things. One is because it depends on decisions by households, by small businesses, and their budgets are strained. They have a great deal of uncertainty about the future, and so they are cutting back on those kinds of expenditures. And the other one has been a purely practical one. By and large, 2020 is not the year where you get people in crawling around your house or crawling over your roof and installing new solar equipment. I suppose that helps to answer the question in a sense. The rebound on the rooftop side will also depend on to a very large degree on the way that the pandemic plays out and the depth of the economic slump, because those people will need to feel confident in their household or business budgets, and they will need to feel confident about bringing workmen around their workplaces and their homes. I suppose the only other thing to say is that there's a link also to new construction of new homes. I mean, because the most effective and the most cost-effective time to put up solar is when you have scaffolding up anyway. So that rate of new construction is a really important indicator for solar, because in the end, it's not the cost of the panels which is critical; it's the cost of the installation that is actually a very critical element in this. On nuclear, I think I can see two questions on nuclear, but the one on small modular reactors. I think in the electricity sector as a whole, there's a premium on flexible operation. There's a premium on, in a sense, finding a role in systems alongside variable sources of generation, such as solar PV and wind. Now, it is a bit of a myth that nuclear is unflexible. I mean, you just have to look at France. Nuclear does vary to accommodate other sources of generation. But it's also true that when you look at the economics of a nuclear power plant, of a traditional one, you don't really want to be running that at very variable utilization rates. So that's why there is a feeling that for nuclear to thrive in the electricity sector, you need to find new technologies, smaller, more flexible. And so we do see that there is a role for that. It does come through in our sustainable development scenario and in the net zero by 2050 case, but it's not ready yet. And it would need an awful lot more work on the research and development side in order to bring that technology to market sometime within the next sort of 10, 15 years. Maybe I can take the other nuclear question straight away. Thoughts on the status of nuclear energy? Nuclear, I mean, the output came down in 2020. as ever, there's a big distinction to be made between the performance of nuclear in advanced economies, so Europe, North America, to an extent Japan, and places like China. The reactors in many advanced economies are relatively old. A lot of them are reaching the end of their operating lifetimes. So if you just look at your advanced economies, 12 reactors closed down in the second half of 2019 and the first half of 2020. Only one started construction. So we are in that phase where, unless something is done, nuclear would play a dwindling role in the electricity generation systems in many advanced economies. The same is not true in China, which becomes the largest generator of nuclear-powered electricity over the next 10 years in our scenarios. So we have made the argument that if you look at, if you value low carbon electricity and you look at some of the cheapest sources of that electricity, lifetime extensions for your existing nuclear plants, it's very difficult to ignore that on an economic basis for as ways to bolster that contribution from that low carbon sector. So nuclear is around 10% of the global electricity supply, but it's a big chunk of that low carbon electricity generation today.
By the way, Coby, if you want to intervene at some point and add something, please feel free to do so.
Well, Tim is in a really good flow, so I will wait for a moment.
So, and Coby, while I have your we have printed copies of the World Energy Outlook, so we will fill that gap in your on your bookshelf. We'll make sure. I mean, there should be one on the way to you very shortly.
Oh, that's wonderful, because I was really upset. It's one of my better collections.
Yeah. Okay, we have a question about geoengineering. I don't know, is this the job of the agency to consider potential for geoengineering, such as, well, I think carbon dioxide removal you do consider, don't you? Solar radiation.
Yeah, so for us, there's a big distinction there between geoengineering and carbon dioxide removal. Yes. So, I mean, our job is to consider, in a sense, the transformation in the energy sector. And there are technologies that would be energy related that could be used for carbon dioxide removal. So using bioenergy with carbon capture, utilization and storage. And then there's some other technologies such as direct air capture of CO2 that could play an important role. We try not to rely too heavily on negative emissions technologies in our outlooks. But there is, of course, a possibility that they become available at scale, and that could make a very significant difference to the eventual stabilization of global temperatures.
Well, there are some people who insist that the best thing you can do to reduce CO2 in the atmosphere is planting trees, and in terms of cost per ton of CO2 removed, that comes in at very low level. But of course, there is an issue about monitoring and certifying.
Well, it's a big part of the plans of some of the countries' national determined commitments already. And for net zero, they even expand that to a level that you think we might run into water scarcity. There's quite a lot of spatial issues with new technologies, but also with trees. So we'll see. But I think that goes to Ignacio's question already. So I'm cheating a bit.
Okay, go ahead. Why don't you say something about Ignacio's question?
Well, just like Europe, I think. I mean, it is good that governments are very ambitious. But if you look at the past records and current investments, then I think we have to, we have to take it as an ambition and not yet. It's not underpinned by any or by very much serious plans. And the EU acknowledges that it's still working on that. And I think with the statement of President Xi Jinping, it is also clear that if you look at the current energy system, really dramatic changes will have to happen, particularly in terms of burning coal unabated. So either they invest really a lot in CCS or CCUS technologies, although you can wonder whether they have sufficient pore space to do that, or they would have to retire some of these fairly modern plants before their economic life is over. So I think there is quite some challenges in order to change the direction, and just energy efficiency or what they've been doing so far is not going to be enough. But that is also the same for some European countries who still have coal, and it makes them have a very slow reduction scheme. If you do that, then you have to deeply decarbonize mobility, built environment, or your industry. Yeah? And of course, one of the ways Europe has reduced its CO2 emissions since 1990 is by letting industry go elsewhere, not just for CO2 reasons, but also for capital and labor costs. But of course, then the CO2 emissions from that production comes on the account of another country. The interesting part would be, we've seen that happen with the United States first, and Europe, and then Japan, where owners or companies began to produce abroad, whether Chinese companies will make a similar move, and that then the emission pressure will come on developing countries when they begin to expand their portfolios more and more abroad. So I think this discussion is not over, and might become quite interesting. Let's put it this way: if we assess national policies and see how. And that is what I like, by the way, of the European plans, is that the industry that is within the borders of the EU should be part and parcel of the energy transition. And policies that chase industry or CO2 emissions away and put it on someone else's plate is not okay. And that is something I think that should happen also for all the other countries. But Tim, maybe you might disagree with me.
Tim, Fatih has said that he wants to see the next 5-year Chinese plan before he passes judgment on the promise to the decarbonizer to reach net zero by 2060. Is the next 5-year plan so important?
I think it is, yeah. I think the 2060 carbon neutrality for China is a sufficiently ambitious target that you can't start in 2030. You need to have, I think you need to see visible evidence of that already in the near term. So I think the announcement on the 14th 5-year plan next year, and then the development of the energy components of that, which typically happens after the big framework is in place. For us, these are critically important indicators. So it's true that the end goal, so the 2060 date, is it's consistent with what we see in the SDS. But in the SDS, we also have quite a significant reduction already by 2030. So, I'm not saying that's the only way to do it, but it's something that we're very aware of. And I think I also need to come back to an issue which is something that Coby raised already. Especially in the case of China, this cannot just be about the electricity sector. You need to take really tough decisions on all sorts of massive steel, cement, other heavy energy intensive industrial sectors in order to get close to that target. And so, in a sense, what we're looking for are signs that transformation is being thought about in a very sort of holistic way. And just one additional point, because it illustrates the way that we construct our scenarios. So on its own, the announcement from China, that's not enough to transfer that into the stated policy scenario. We're going to look for the detail. We want to see how it happens. And so what goes into the stated policy scenario will be our assessment, not of the target, but of the measures, the detail. And then you can, in a sense, get a sense for the residual, the gap that might still exist. So we are we're fairly tough on those kinds of pronouncements, although we welcome them as a huge step forward.
A bit of St. Thomas incredulity. The next question, Anne is asking if you think that there is a possibility of a large-scale mobilization, popular mobilization. I would phrase it a bit differently. In your interactions, do you think that people are conscious of the enormity of the effort that would be required even before they start mobilizing?
I don't know. I think there's a sense from the transformation of the electricity sector that the energy transition happens out there somewhere. The system changes, and I basically carry on much the same. I might next car might be an electric one, but there's a lot more that needs to happen. I mean, we really need to retool the entire energy system. That means the boiler that heats your water. That means the insulation on your house. And that means all sorts of other aspects of that penetrate much more closely into your daily life and your decisions. So I think those are the issues that for us remain very difficult to see, how exactly they're going to play out. I think the question though is an interesting one, because it's true that in some ways, for citizens of cities who experienced periods of much cleaner air, visibly cleaner air, that does have an impact on the way that they view the possibility of change in the future. And indeed, we have seen a sort of normalization of more radical policies in some areas by governments. And so that has led to expectations that maybe we can do the same in other areas of economic and social life. But I wouldn't stretch the analogy too far. I mean, many of the impacts that we've seen in 2020, again, as I said during the presentation, they've come for all the wrong reasons. We need to disassociate that transformation in the energy sector from some of the sort of deprivations and other things that we've seen this year.
And
I think, I think, Tim, if you go into the discussion, we would like to show in the discussion what will happen to your home and your maybe your mobility. But the really difficult discussion is on getting the same boilers and furnaces for industry, which are really large. You really need really very, very large wind parks or solar parks just to keep them going 24/7 and 365 days a year. So just saying that we want to do the energy transition, but we do not want to export our CO2 emissions anymore, has really deep implications on everything that we need to do in the next coming years, and we have to start somewhere. And I think the enormity of, or the volumes of energy that we're talking about, I think that's where people lose understanding, because when you're in a discussion and people say, yeah, but I have 6 solar panels and I drive electric, so I'm climate neutral, then I think, okay, where do I start? Yeah.
I think the key point is that this really requires the coordinated action of literally billions of decision makers, which is extremely difficult to achieve. Policies can introduce incentives, of course, but there will be, in any case, a huge investment effort on the part of households required on the part of households to, you know, change almost everything in their homes, not just light bulbs, but much more. And it's not clear that households are in a position to undertake this kind of investment, and governments can incentivize, but it's not to be believed that they can purely and simply pay for all of it, because in the end it's the same households that pay taxes and support the governments. So it's a very momentous effort, no?
But I think there's a tendency to, and I said, underestimate the inertia in the system. And so, I mean, we looked in some detail over the last couple of weeks at the data coming from China. You know, China is somewhat of an outlier. You know, growth in electricity demand this year already. The economy likewise probably expanded in 2020. But you know, emissions were back to pre-crisis levels already in April. And since then, they've been higher. There is this, unless you actively shift the system onto a different track, you know, it has this inexorable tendency to reassert itself over time. And that's why we emphasize so much the importance of, you know, that deep structural change.
Yes, that's the work of the market, because after all, if you try to compress the consumption of something, the price of that something will go down and it will become more attractive. So there is this resistance and inertia. We have a question about gas consumption and the decrease in gas consumption in Europe, and whether this will undermine Russia's influence. Perhaps this is more for Coby than for Tim.
Well, maybe also because we mentioned old students of the Energy Master at Sciences Po. We had a wonderful seminar on Monday morning with Jean-Baptiste de Breu, but also with Gergely Molnar, who actually took one of my classes. So every time we do that, I'm really proud that I think, yes, Giacomo, that's what we said we wanted to achieve. And sometimes you have these sweet moments. But Gergely and Jean-Baptiste also explained what was going on in gas. And one of the remarkable things is that that actually before, yes, demand declined, but Russian supply actually contracted quite a lot more. So it was pipeline supplies that contracted a lot more than LNG. LNG only began to reduce late in May, yeah, when there was some issues. Does it impact influence in Europe? I don't really think so, because it's part of what Tim already mentioned, the infrastructures there. Fundamentally, Russian supplies are the most competitive that can reach the European market, and we have an internal market system. And maybe, if I may add, every molecule that enters the European market, the minute it's in the market, is a European gas molecule. That seems to be very confusing for governments and whatever, who always refer, whether it's been going through the pipeline system 6 times around, going through all the interconnections, it's still referred to as Russian gas, but gas that has entered the EU is becoming European gas. And I think that is important also to change the content of the gas discussion a little bit, because it is very politicized, particularly with regard to Nord Stream 2. It's been become incredibly politicized, and whether the influence of Russian gas. I think we should also look at it this way. If you look at since 2014, gas prices have really declined quite a bit. if you look at the EU energy balance and the import of energy and the share of Russia in that import, we see a tremendous decline, but also that the share of Russia is maybe somewhat larger in oil and oil products, but not really very big in natural gas income. So that's already one big issue that we should consider. Also, I think for Russia, it is very important because they have a very long border on the Asian continent. For them, security of demand is as important as security of supply, maybe for importing countries. And I think given the heavy investment of Gazprom, or some people would say Russia, on also modernizing the supply system to Europe shows how important gas supplies to Europe are. And maybe if we follow the story of the energy transition, then of course the signal Europe is sending is that, you know, give it 2 decades and we hope to have a much more hybrid system where hydrogen has already taken over. So in some parts, or at least it will play an important role. So I'm inclined to say that at the moment, given the very large supplies of natural gas under these circumstances, that Europe is at the moment more important for Russia than vice versa, even though we cannot do without Russian supplies. I mean, it's simple as that. But it's clear for a pipeline supplier. The same goes for Algeria and Norway. Yeah, if there would be an interruption, then of course that would have a large impact. But in terms of how the discussion has been done in Europe, but also in the United States. Yeah, that's, for me, it's much more gas politics than gas flows and facts on the ground.
Thank you, Coby, for that. Next, we have two interesting questions. One is about Latin America and how Latin America can deal with the transition. And another one is about prospects for hydroelectricity in Africa, and specifically exports to Europe. Now, I think both points to hydroelectricity because you know, the potential for hydro in Latin America is huge and could be a decisive tool for achieving a transition in ways that are simply not possible in Europe. Or for that matter, even in Asia, although Asia has some margin of maneuver. And the same is true for Africa. Are you not underestimating the potential and the role of hydroelectricity in the WEO, Tim?
I think the Clingendael project is an extremely interesting one in that respect. I mean, we did a deep dive on Africa, I think in 2014. We did another one in 2019. And the role of those large cross-border hydro projects actually decreased between those two. So over that 5-year period in our outlook. And the reason for that is because the lower costs of solar in particular meant that countries could, in a sense, they had more of a resource, more of a cost competitive resource available to them within their national borders than they had before. And the difficulty with those grand projects, of which Clingendael is by far the grandest, is that they rely on not just on the build out of infrastructure, but they rely on a degree of trust and a degree of willingness to import electricity, which is obviously a vital commodity. And that, as we've seen in many more integrated markets than in those in Africa, we've seen that in Europe, it's controversial to rely on electricity from your neighbors. You saw that in the US. Oregon, you know, in the end didn't deliver electricity to California during the recent wildfires. That's within a highly integrated system. And so those kinds of projects have found it difficult to move ahead. Now, hydrogen offers a way around that. because you could have, with extremely low-cost renewables, a way to produce low-carbon hydrogen and eventually export that. So export an electricity-intensive product rather than the electricity itself. The difficulty with that, in a sense, is that the demand for hydrogen isn't there yet to support a massive project of that kind. The second thing is that the transportation of hydrogen remains a difficult issue. It's not completely clear how you do that. Do you transport it like LNG, but then you have to reduce the temperature even more than you do for methane? Do you try and transform it into some hydrogen-rich compound? But then you have handling issues. Most of these compounds are quite toxic. It's not clear how you manage that. And it's also then becomes quite expensive. So there's a few issues that may complicate those kinds of projects. But I think there's one overarching consideration for a project like that in Africa, and that's this kind of desert tech issue. Are you really going to have a model for development which relies on the export of that commodity, the export of that advantage, at a time when there are still many, many millions of people in the Democratic Republic of Congo that are without electricity? And finding that balance between the exported commodity and the imperative for local development, I think is another extremely challenging one to crack.
Okay, thank you. We have time for another couple of questions. So, Anne, you will forgive me, but I already took a question from you, so I will move to the next ones. To the question from Erpu and Julien Henault. Erpu is asking whether the pandemic can support, can be a help, a push into local renewables, especially in emerging economies. Can you see that, or is it the opposite, which is true, that the pandemic constitutes an obstacle to greater uptake of local renewables, small-scale renewables?
I mean, there are some, well, I think this is a point that Professor van der Linde mentioned earlier, is about this question of global integration. To what extent, how do global supply chains emerge from today's crisis? And there are some signs that at least for some categories of product, people prefer stuff that's manufactured at home, that's produced at home. That could lead to some, in a sense, repatriation of some parts of some supply chains. I think insofar as this could affect the future of a globalized economy, I mean, that would appear to be bad news for commodities that are widely traded internationally, and I think gas might be vulnerable there, but it could be good news for large indigenous resources, whether that's renewables or potentially even in some instances for coal. But I have to say that if you're thinking about a dramatic, rapid transition, you can't afford to have a very fragmented world. I mean, every single rapid transition is a sort of cooperative one, where innovations in one part of the world eventually feed through into deployment in other parts of the world. And so the idea that you can sort of do this any other way rapidly, I think, is a mistake. And it goes to the point from the Latin America question as well. There are some technologies where Latin America is going to be in the forefront. I mean, biofuels in Brazil, for example, and hydro is another good example. But in other instances, if you're going to decarbonize those economies cost effectively, you're going to rely on the innovation, the technology developments that are taking place in Europe or in China or in America or in some other countries. So I think we need to keep in mind that the sort of open economy is still going to be very important for that energy transformation.
We have next a question about the rebound effect. This is something that you mentioned implicitly in your presentation. I mean, to what extent once the pandemic is over and we have a recovery, there will be simply a comeback of emissions.
And I can say a couple of words on that. I mean, there's certainly that possibility. And I think the data from China indicate how that could play out. However, there is one important caveat there, where the pandemic doesn't just result in lower utilization of some assets, but actually their removal from the system. And you've seen in Europe and in North America that the pandemic has effectively accelerated the retirement of some old capacity, notably some coal-fired capacity. In our view, a decent chunk. I mean, there's going to be, in our stated policy scenario, there's around 275 gigawatts of coal that's retired over the next 10 years worldwide. That's more than 10% of the global total. So you need to, when you think about the global coal fleet, of course, there are still additions coming through in parts of Asia, but there's also quite a lot being subtracted. And the amount that's being subtracted has actually been accelerated in some ways by this economic slump. So the answer is, of course, yes, there is a risk of rebound. It depends very much on policies and whether you get some encouragement for people to buy more efficient equipment as they, that could even be a part of some stimulus packages in some ways. But then there's also this, you need to look not just at what we add to the system, but the stuff that is gradually being removed from it as well.
I'm going to stretch your patience, Tim, and keep you answering for a few more minutes, if you don't mind. The next one is deceptively easy. You just need to give us a number. What is your price for carbon, the needed price for carbon?
To reach net zero, huh? That's crucial in that question.
Yeah, I mean, I can give what the CO2 price is around $150 a ton 2040 in the Sustainable Development Scenario. But CO2 prices are not going to get us the whole way to net zero. There's no question. I mean, they do in some of the models, but in practice, there are parts of the energy system where CO2 prices are quite effective in changing utilization or changing choices. And there are others where you're going to need a range of instruments. And so I would, a carbon price is going to be necessary, but it's not sufficient to deliver a net zero outcome.
Yes. Again, a question on hydropower. We touched this already, and I think you see some difficulties and hope at the same time for hydropower. Switch to electric vehicles is a critical factor of emissions reduction. Beyond the question of the energy mix that fuels electric cars, what are the perspectives of decarbonization for the battery industry? I think that's an open question and something that may constitute a surprise down the road.
It's a great question. It's also one that we are starting work on now for some analysis that will be coming out next year. We're going to be looking at the fact that many clean energy technologies use some of these critical minerals and metals more intensively than fossil fuel technologies. So you are going to see some, in a rapid transition, you get potentially some quite interesting strains on supply chains, some of which are already very concentrated. Cobalt is always the example that comes up, but there are other examples too. So I think, there's, I mean, I don't have a feel for the sort of the energy footprint of those supply chains. We'll be looking at that, but I think the governance of those new resource questions is going to become an increasingly important issue for people who, like yourselves, who look closely at international energy politics.
We have two questions about coal. Maybe you are too optimistic about the demise of coal because on one hand, China is contributing to building a number of coal power plants around the world. And also there are countries that are highly dependent on coal, such as Indonesia in particular. And how do you see the prospects of taming the tendency of these countries to keep on using coal because they have it and they rely on it? Can and should the industrial countries do something to specifically incentivize this beyond the border adjustment mechanism that some people propose and wish to see?
It's certainly true that coal demand decreases in our scenario, but coal doesn't go away. I mean, it dips under 20% of the global energy mix by 2040 in the stated policy scenario. I mean, for the first time since the Industrial Revolution, but 20% of primary energy, that's a lot of energy still. And so, I mean, that's why we put a lot of emphasis on not just on what gets built, but what you do with what you have. And essentially, there's three options when it comes to your existing coal-fired fleet. If you want to reduce emissions from it, you can retrofit with CCUS. You can repurpose. I mean, or you can co-fire with biomass as well to reduce emissions. Or you do something to reduce the emissions from the existing operation. You can repurpose that facility in a way to provide more flexibility rather than constant generation, and that also then brings down the emissions. And then, you know, the other option, of course, is retirement. And a combination of those three in the sustainable development scenario is how we get those coal-related emissions down much more rapidly. But I think the question is completely correct. Coal has been progressively revised down in successive world energy outlooks. The outlook for coal demand in our sort of new policy scenario, what's now the stated policy scenario. You know, that in itself is not a game changer for global emissions. You know, you need to do more than just put it on a gentle downward trajectory. And I think that speaks a little bit to something that you see in the oil market as well. There's this sort of obsession with, you know, will oil demand peak or not? And is it going to peak now or is it going to peak in 10 years? It doesn't make a huge difference for the global climate whether the oil demand in 20 years is 101 million barrels a day or 90 million barrels a day. You know, the difference in the marginal difference there is not great. So I think we need to focus on some of the big structural questions, not just this marginal, the point or the year in which coal demand might peak or not.
I will pick one last question for you that I think is a bit technical maybe, but particularly interesting. And that is, to what extent global population growth affects the outlook for reductions, significant emission reductions. I think, you know, we tend to see global population growth as a given, but we have had several examples of surprise developments and rapid demographic transitions, and the pandemic has certainly had the effect of discouraging population growth in many areas that have been affected. So is that something that may constitute a positive surprise, a slowdown in population growth? Have you done any thinking about this?
So population assumptions, that's one of the things that we take exogenously. So we just take in the median variant of the UN population projections. And that gets us from about, whatever, 7.5 billion today to just over 9 billion in 2040. A lot of that growth comes from Africa. India becomes the most populous country in the world relatively soon. All of that, in our projections, all of that population on a net basis is added to the world's urban population. So that has a very large implications then for our projections. Now, we haven't done any sort of sensitivity analysis on what might happen if that comes down or if that growth is lessened. I mean, there is certainly a possibility, and there are some academic papers on this that suggest that trend towards sort of ever longer life expectancy in some countries, it might be reversed, at least temporarily, because of the pandemic. And I think you could also see some implications, not just from the direct health implication, so not just from the direct health impacts of COVID, but also from the increase in extreme poverty that you're also witnessing as the result. So it's one that we will certainly keep an eye on. But again, I come back to something that I said before. Our job, in a sense, from the International Energy Agency is to give insights to energy policymakers. Now, it's not particularly useful for us to come back to policymakers and say, well, we found a way to get emissions down. We'll just have 1 billion fewer people in the world. I mean, that, you know, and so we tend to, in a sense, work within the parameters of, you know, the energy system that come from reasonable assumptions about the future. If you look at some deep emissions reduction scenarios, a lot of them tend to have relatively low assumptions about GDP growth or relatively modest increases in global population. And of course, they deliver low emissions, but I'm not sure they deliver huge insights into how we get there.
Yes, that's what DMV-GL does. I mean, they lower the population. Okay, thank you very much. I think we cannot ask you to stay longer and resist this barrage of questions. Thank you, Coby. Thank you, Tim. Thank you all that have been actively participating. I always say that, you know, we are accustomed to having an excess of questions and not being able to respond to all. So you will forgive me, but we really need to close at this point. And again, you know, we hope next year for sure to be able to welcome you in one of the big auditoriums of Sciences Po. Thank you, Tim.
Well, it's always a pleasure, and I look forward to this event. So I very much hope to see you all in person before too long. And thanks very much, Coby, Giacomo, and to all of those who participated today.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.